This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the stockbroker clerked, Lady Frances Carfax disappeared, and Bruce Partington planned, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever wondered what a commissionaire does? Or what a compositor is? Or of the difference between a stevedore and a stoker?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 185, The Women of Influence. Well, hello and welcome once again to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details of some of the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And you are very influential in your own right, Burt.
I can't hear you. I'm writing a letter to my congressman.
Well, you influence me, if nothing else. I don't know if that's...
Well, that's a good start. Now I just have 698 more million people to go.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I wish you well with that. And we'll hit at least 2 of them in this podcast. Well, if you would like to see the show notes for this episode, they are available at ihose.co/trifles185. That'll take you to our website, SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. There you can find links to things we're talking about here, as well as the ability to listen to the show on whatever platform you subscribe to us on. And you do subscribe, I hope. You can also get email updates from us, letting you know when a new episode comes out, which is every Wednesday, we might add. So thank you for being here. Please consider subscribing on whatever mode works for you. Well, this is the monthly feature that we call Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist, where we look at some theory of past scholarship. We usually take from some journal or other, some popular publication at one point that maybe you don't have your hands on right now, but we thought it was worth resurfacing and discussing. And in this case, we have this is the first in a 4-parter, and this comes from the Sherlock Holmes Journal. The article in question is called Women of the Canon, The Women of Influence. It's the first installment, and it is by none other than Molly Hardwick. It appeared in the Sherlock Holmes Journal, Volume 10, Number 1, which I believe was 1972. It is available, of course, in book format, if you'd like to get it, from the Sherlock Holmes Society of London in the Best of the Sherlock Holmes Journal, Volume 2. Lovely green cover, edited by Nick Utekin and with a foreword by Pam Bruxner. So, Burt, we are starting our multi-part series on this monthly feature with this wonderful article by Molly Hardwick. Why don't you frame it up for us by what she's referring to with respect to the women of influence?
It's a wonderful story, and of course Molly Hardwick was a great writer, and that's one of the lovely things about the essay, because in addition to the content, it's beautifully written. Molly Hardwick, it's by saying, far from being a woman hater, Sherlock Holmes entertained for them an intuitive sympathy and a deep understanding. And it has been held against him that he condemned them as never to be entirely trusted, not the best of them. But she goes on to say he lived in an age when it was fashionable for philosophers, wits, and dramatists, male, of course, to pigeonhole women as dear little bundles of nonsense. But she goes on, and it's beautifully written. Now, again, this is 1972, so this is a completely different cultural era, obviously, about the role of women. Interestingly enough, early on in the essay, she mentions that Conan Doyle was opposed to the cause of women's suffrage, which I didn't have in my head. I mean, I've read a lot about Conan Doyle. I take it as read since Molly Hardwick is telling us. But on the other hand, I can't remember anything positive I've ever read about Conan Doyle and women's suffrage. So I find that's interesting. But regardless of that, she goes on to say, who were these women who were privileged to receive Mr. Holmes' sympathy, advice, and invaluable help? Some, she says, were the victims of circumstances. Some, the helpless, fluttering charmers of the Victorian female image. But among them are an astonishing number of women who concealed a strong, even powerful character beneath that indefinable charm of weakness which custom compelled them to wear, and their strength emerges as the cases unfold. And so a great start is with Mary Morstan, dressed in the most perfect taste, though with a touch of appealing shabbiness, which caused Mr. Holmes to pay her what she said, Molly Hardwick says, is surely the highest compliment to a woman in the canon. Holmes says, I think she is one of the most charming young ladies I ever met, and she might have been most useful in such work as we've been doing. She had a decided genius that way. Witness the way in which she preserved that Agra plan from all the other papers of her father.
And Hardwick goes on to suppose, she said, is it beyond supposition that had ill health not pursued poor Mary and carried her off so soon, that she would have become a third in that happy partnership in Baker Street? True, she made a little face of disappointment when her husband was called to the door on the night which began the adventure of the man with the twisted lip. A patient, she said. You'll have to go out. But never once do we hear her objecting to Watson's throwing in his lot with Holmes. Indeed, she encouraged him to do so. Surely she would have preferred the company and comradeship of 221B to lonely vigils in the little house near Paddington, her needlework her only occupation. Woman of tact that she was, it is certain that she would not have aroused Mrs. Hudson's resentment by interference with that lady's domestic arrangements.
Yeah, and she goes on to say, she quotes Watson, Molly Hardwick quotes Watson, folk who were in grief came to my wife like birds to a lighthouse. And as an indication of the fact that she really would have fit in quite well in Baker Street.
Well, that's interesting because when you think about her preservation of the Agra map, and we know of Holmes' own horror of destroying documents, and of people flocking to her like birds to a lighthouse, just like clients flock to Holmes. Here we have a woman who was probably far more like Holmes than she was like Watson, and perhaps that explains Watson's natural attraction to her.
Well, here, there's another example, too, of women, even better than preserving the Agra map, of characters whose strength, as Molly Hardwick says, emerges as the cases unfold, and that's Kitty Winter, the slim, flame-like young woman who took a terrible revenge on Baron Gruner. She defied, says Molly Hardwick, the icy contempt of Violet de Merville in order to warn her off Gruner by the example of her own downfall. And then, undeterred by the dangers of guard dogs, canine or human, she entered the grounds of Gruner's magnificent house, hid in a laurel bush, and deluged her one-time lover with vitriol. And it's gratifying, says Molly Hardwick, to know that her court sentence was the lowest that was possible for such an offense.
That's fascinating because, we're talking about women of influence. And, in this day and age, we hear all about quote-unquote influencers online, which typically means people with many followers. And that's always irked me because to me, influence is about outcome. It's about results. It's not about how loud you can shout or the how much you can wave your arms. And it's interesting because Kitty Winter, to me, strikes me as someone who, despite her status, her lowly status, she does her best to be influential in front of Violet de Merville. And in normal circumstances, it would have worked. In the case of someone who wasn't under the spell of a cult-like figure of Baron Gruner, Kitty Winter's intercession would have been effective. Now, ultimately, Kitty certainly does become effective by disfiguring the Baron. And Holmes becomes effective as well by virtue of taking possession of the Baron's journal. And the two of them together, I think, work their influence to bring the case to a satisfactory conclusion. But Kitty Winter, in front of her intended audience, in front of Violet de Merville, is not actually effective as an influential figure.
Right.
But she certainly does move Holmes to action. So Kitty Winter, in terms of being influential to Holmes, very effective.
True. I never would have put into the bucket of influential characters in the canon, which is my fault, really. Influential female characters in the canon. Rachel Howells, whom we spoke about in the last episode from the Musgrave Ritual. But Molly Hardwick points out that, or describes Rachel Howells as undoubtedly one of the most single-minded and daring, which, I think is not a unfair characteristic. She says perhaps it was by chance that Brunton was shut into his underground tomb, or perhaps not. But even better than that, another character whom I didn't recall at all was Elise, the beautiful German who rescued Victor Hatherley from death in The Engineer's Thumb. And I'd completely forgotten about Elise.
Sure.
But it's
Beethoven didn't.
No, not at all. And she organized Victor Hatherley's escape through a window, hotly pursued by the Colonel and his cleaver.
Well, more on these influential women right after this quick word. You know, we say the Baker Street Journal is an irregular quarterly of Sherlockiana, but the fact is you can count on the Baker Street Journal to arrive in your mailbox if you're a regular subscriber 5 times a year. That's once a quarter plus the Christmas annual. And each time it arrives, it has a regular array of features such as the editor's gas lamp, Art in the Blood, the Commonplace Book, Baker Street Inventory, and more. And of course, peppered throughout are insightful articles and scholarship that make the world of Sherlock Holmes come alive to people around the world as they try their hand at finding out deeper details about some of the minutiae in the stories or about Victorian life. If you don't yet, please consider a subscription to the Baker Street Journal. Go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and make sure you get your regular delivery of the journal today. We are back talking about women of influence. And, it's interesting because when I first saw Women of Influence as the title of this article in the Sherlock Holmes Journal, I thought of women of regal or high status, of an upper class. That's I think would be the natural definition that one would apply to that title. And yet, many of the women we've been talking about here are just ordinary women, or in some cases, servants or lower class women of the time. And yet, that does not mean they can't be influential in their own right. I think there are some really wonderful examples of that here.
Yeah. And, just as an aside, it's a lovely thing to think about this list of characters compared to other female characters in fiction around the same time. I mean, think about the cases of Dr. Thorndyke. I'm a big fan of Austin Freeman's Dr. Thorndyke. Agatha Christie's sort of an inappropriate example because Christie's mostly about plot and doesn't really draw deep characters. But think about other characters and stories by the Baroness Orczy and by Ernest Brahm as Max Carados and the other people who were writing in the late 19th century, early 20th century. You don't really have these, and these characters sort of spring back as you talk about them. They're very characteristic, drawn beautifully in just a few sketches. Molly Hardwick goes on to talk about the nihilist Anna, the wearer of the golden pince-nez.
Sure.
And it's a wonderful example. And Molly Hardwick says it's unfortunate that her extreme short sight led her to stab the wrong person. But, says Molly Hardwick, the traditional figure of justice herself is blind.
Oh, that's wonderful. I like that. And you think about this, when she was ready to tell her story after she came out from behind her hiding place there, I believe Professor Coram, and I'm just going by memory here, pleaded with her and said, "My life is in your hands." You can't get much more influential than that when you hold the power of life and death over an individual.
Right. Now, of course, we're on our way, as we go through this review, to the most celebrated and prominent female character in the canon. But on the way there, interestingly enough, Molly Hardwick points out, what about Madame Isadora Klein, who's ruined young Douglas Maberly of the Three Gables? She was, of course, she says, quoting Holmes's description, the most celebrated beauty. There was never a woman to touch her, the richest as well as the most lovely widow upon earth. She is the belle dame sans merci of fiction. And Molly Hardwick says, it's the only point in the canon where Holmes quotes that most romantic of romantics, Keats. And after the confrontation, Watson notes that so roguish and exquisite did she look as she stood before us with a challenging smile that I felt, of all Holmes's criminals, this was the one whom he would find it hardest to face.
Interesting. And Watson continues saying, however, and he says this with obvious disappointment, he was immune from sentiment. One wonders, had Madame Isadora been a loathsome, slithery Milverton, would her brilliant opponent have been so ready to compound a felony as usual? He seems to let her off remarkably lightly. His final warning to her contains an oblique compliment to her dainty hands. Now,
well, and that... Yep, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to pause there for a moment and wonder, hearing her story, Isabella Klein talked about how she had been wronged. And, this was her revenge. And again, you talk about disproportionate justice. I mean, this is one of those cases where I'm sure she didn't intend for Maberly to meet his demise as young as he did. But she felt she had been wronged, and Holmes listened to her with somewhat of a sympathetic ear, enough so that he basically let her off in the end.
Yeah. Yes. He seems, says Molly Hardwick, to let her off remarkably lightly, and his final warning to her contains an oblique compliment to her dainty hands.
They're not dainty. My hands are perfectly well formed. Sorry. But yeah, that leads us into, and Watson, Hardwick says this very pointedly. She was, of course, a type, Sherlock Holmes's type. The woman who could match him intellectually, arouse his curiosity, return him blow for blow, entertain him with her humor, and dazzle him with her beauty. And the archetype is Irena Adler, of dubious and questionable memory.
And that's a little sad. You get to, of course, you're leading up to Irene in this really great essay. And what's sad about it is that really Molly Hardwick takes as read that everyone who's reading this already understands the depth and strength and nature of Irene Adler. And so, she doesn't really say all that much about Irene, except that, Watson's account has been so often quoted that I don't need to really repeat anything. But she does have some nice descriptions. She says, a great wizard met a great enchantress, and the consequence was the immortal conflict that is known as a scandal in Bohemia. Irene towers above all other women in the canon, a fine feminine flower of the late 19th century, above criticism or condescension like her mighty opponent.
We do not know her epitaph, but one would wager that it would not be very different from that devised by the late Harry Graham for another charming opportunist. Weep not for little Leonie, abducted by a French marquis. The loss of honor was a wrench. Just think how it's improved her French.
And I have no idea what that refers to. Harry Graham or Leonie.
I don't either, but it strikes me as just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
From what I have seen of the lady, yes, indeed, she is on a very different level to your Majesty.